The bitter wind of December 26, 1776, cut through the tattered Continental Army like a blade through worn cloth. General George Washington stood at the bow of the Durham boat, ice crystals forming on his weathered face. As he gazed across the Delaware River's churning waters, behind him, 2,400 desperate men huddled in makeshift boats, their breath creating ghostly clouds in the frigid air. The Revolution hung by a thread thinner than spider's silk. Washington's mind raced as the boats navigated between ice floes that threatened to crush their fragile vessels. The Continental Army had suffered devastating defeats throughout the autumn, retreating across New Jersey in what many called a full rout. Philadelphia trembled behind them, and Congress had fled to Baltimore like startled deer. Enlistments would expire in 5 days, and with them, perhaps the dream of American independence itself. The crossing had begun at 6 in the evening, but nature conspired against them. What should have taken 3 hours stretched into 9 as sleet turned to snow, then to a howling nor'easter that seemed sent by the British gods themselves. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead fishermen, weathered veterans of New England's brutal coast, fought the river with the same determination they had once battled Atlantic storms. Their skilled hands guided the boats through waters that would have claimed lesser men. As dawn approached on December 27th, Washington's gamble seemed increasingly desperate. The element of surprise, so crucial to his plan, hung in the balance with each passing minute. His target was Trenton, where Hessian Colonel Johann Rall commanded nearly 1,500 professional soldiers, men who had earned fearsome reputations on European battlefields. These weren't British colonials or untested militia, they were hardened warriors who had served Frederick the Great and survived the bloodiest conflicts of their age. The irony wasn't lost on Washington that he was about to attack German mercenaries, with an army that included many German immigrants fighting for American freedom. Among his ranks marched men like Captain Alexander Hamilton, barely 19, but already proving himself an exceptional artillery officer, and the towering presence of General Nathanael Greene, whose tactical mind would prove crucial in the coming hours. According to historian David Hackett Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing, this moment represented perhaps the most desperate gamble in American military history. The boats finally scraped against the Pennsylvania shore as pale winter light began to filter through the storm clouds. Washington's boots crunched on frozen ground as he stepped onto solid earth. His famous crossing now complete, but his greatest challenge still ahead. The men who followed him bore little resemblance to a professional army, their feet left bloody prints in the snow, many wrapped in rags since proper boots had long since worn through. Yet something burned in their hollow eyes, a flame that defeats and retreat couldn't extinguish. Time was slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Every minute they delayed gave the Hessians more opportunity to discover their approach. Washington knew that surprise was his only advantage against professional soldiers who could load and fire 3 volleys to his men's 1. As he mounted his horse and looked back at his frost-covered army, he understood that the next few hours would determine whether the United States of America would be born or still born in the snows of New Jersey. The march to Trenton began in the pre-dawn darkness, with destiny walking beside every Continental soldier who placed one frozen foot in front of the other. The cobblestones of Trenton gleamed with ice as the first Continental soldiers emerged from the swirling snow like phantoms, materializing from a winter nightmare. It was 8 o'clock on the morning of December 27th, 1776, and the Hessian sentries had barely enough time to cry or find before American musket balls whistled past their ears. Washington had divided his force into 2 columns, a risky maneuver that could have spelled disaster if either wing had been discovered prematurely. General Nathanael Greene led the northern column down the Pennington Road, while General John Sullivan's men approached from the south along River Road. The pincer movement was textbook military strategy, but executing it with exhausted, half-frozen volunteers in a snowstorm required either genius or madness, perhaps both. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery of 6-pound cannons thundered to life at the head of King Street, their iron voices echoing off the brick buildings like the drums of Judgment Day. The young artillery officer, his face blackened with powder smoke, directed his crews with precision that belied his youth. Each cannonball that crashed into Hessian positions carried with it the hopes of a struggling nation. Colonel Johann Rall burst from his headquarters, still wearing his dress uniform from the previous night's Christmas celebration. The veteran officer had dismissed warnings about American activity, confident that no army would dare attack in such weather. His arrogance now cost precious seconds as he struggled to comprehend the chaos erupting around him. Hessian soldiers stumbled from their quarters, many without proper equipment, trying to form defensive lines in streets suddenly filled with American soldiers. The Hessians were professional warriors, but they had been caught in the worst possible position, surprised, scattered, and fighting in an urban environment that negated many of their tactical advantages. Their famed discipline, which had made them feared across Europe, couldn't compensate for the fundamental military principle that Washington had exploited. The initiative belongs to the attacker. Through the smoke and snow, Washington appeared, wherever the fighting was fiercest, his massive frame on horseback unmistakable even in the swirling storm. A Hessian musket ball grazed his horse, but the general never flinched. His presence alone seemed to inspire his men to superhuman efforts. These weren't the same demoralized soldiers who had retreated across New Jersey just weeks before. They fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The battle raged through Trenton's narrow streets for barely 90 minutes, but those minutes contained enough violence and confusion to fill a lifetime. Hessian attempts to wheel their artillery into position were thwarted by American marksmen who had learned their deadly craft hunting in Pennsylvania's forests. Every doorway potentially concealed a Continental soldier. Every street corner could become a killing ground. Historian William Stryker's comprehensive account of the battles of Trenton and Princeton describes how the urban terrain transformed the engagement into a series of violent encounters that favored the more flexible American tactics. Colonel Rahl fell mortally wounded while trying to rally his men near the Methodist Church, a musket ball finding its mark as he attempted to organize a counterattack. His death effectively ended organized Hessian resistance, though pockets of soldiers continued, fighting with professional determination even as their position became hopeless. By 9:30, the impossible had occurred. Nearly 900 Hessian soldiers surrendered to Washington's army, while only the Continental soldiers lay dead in the bloody snow. The victory was so complete, so unexpected, that many participants would later describe it as miraculous. Wagons loaded with captured weapons, supplies, and 40 hogsheads of rum began the journey back across the Delaware. But Washington knew that one victory, however dramatic, could not resurrect the dying revolution. The British would respond with overwhelming force, and his army remained a fragile instrument that could shatter with the next defeat. As he watched his men load their prisoners onto boats, he was already planning his next move. Trenton had bought time and restored morale, but the war was far from won. The crossing back to Pennsylvania occurred under darkening skies, with British reinforcements already marching toward the sound of battle. Yet for the first time in months, American soldiers sang as they rowed, their voices carrying across the icy waters like harbingers of hope. Lord Charles Cornwallis received the devastating news of Trenton's fall while dining in New York, the crystal wine glass frozen halfway to his lips as his aide delivered the impossible report. The British general, who had been preparing to sail for England and his wife sick, felt the weight of military necessity crush his personal desires. Within hours, he was riding hard toward Princeton with 8,000 of Britain's finest soldiers, determined to crush Washington's impudent rebellion once and for all. The march south through New Jersey revealed the depth of American resistance that had previously been hidden. Bridges were destroyed, roads blocked with felled trees, and every mile brought news of Loyalist families fleeing north with tales of patriot reprisals. The Hessian defeat had transformed the colony's political landscape overnight. Fence-sitters were choosing sides, and most were choosing Washington. Meanwhile, Washington faced his own agonizing decision. The Delaware River lay behind him like a liquid wall of safety, but crossing back to Pennsylvania would surrender all the psychological advantages gained at Trenton. His army was still a collection of militia units and volunteers whose enlistments expired in 4 days. Logic dictated retreat, but Washington had passed beyond logic into the realm where wars are won or lost on intuition and will. On December 30th, 1776, Washington made perhaps the most audacious decision of his military career. Instead of retreating across the Delaware, he would recross it and establish a defensive position south of Trenton. The move baffled both his officers and his enemies. It seemed to violate every principle of military science. Yet Washington understood something that textbooks couldn't teach. Momentum in war is more valuable than safety. The second crossing of the Delaware lacked the dramatic desperation of the first, but it carried equal significance. This time, Washington brought additional forces. including Philadelphia militia units that had been shamed into service by Trenton's success. The combined force totaled approximately 5,000 men, still heavily outnumbered, but no longer the demoralized rabble that had fled across New Jersey in November. Cornwallis reached Trenton on January 2, 1777, expecting to find Washington cowering behind the Delaware's protective waters. Instead, he discovered American forces dug in along Assunpink Creek, their position anchored by artillery that commanded the Stone Bridge crossing. The British general's frustration was palpable. He had marched his army through freezing weather to fight an enemy who refused to cooperate by running away. Military historian John Buchanan, in his definitive work The Road to Valley Forge, emphasizes how Washington's decision to recross the Delaware represented a fundamental shift from defensive to offensive thinking. In American strategy, the afternoon battle along Assunpink Creek proved inconclusive, but costly for both sides. British and Hessian forces launched repeated assaults against American positions, only to be repulsed by devastating artillery fire. Captain Hamilton's guns, now reinforced by captured Hessian cannon, turned the creek crossing into a killing ground where red-coated bodies accumulated like autumn leaves as darkness fell. Cornwallis faced a dilemma. His army controlled Trenton, but couldn't dislodge Washington from the creek line. The American position was strong, but it was also a trap. The Delaware River at their backs meant no retreat. If the position was overrun, British officers urged an immediate night assault, but Cornwallis demurred. "We'll bag the old fox in the morning," he reportedly declared, confident that daylight would reveal the hopelessness of Washington's situation. That night, around campfires that flickered like stars in the New Jersey darkness, both armies prepared for what seemed certain to be a decisive battle. British soldiers cleaned their muskets and checked their equipment with professional thoroughness, while American sentries peered nervously across the creek at enemy fires that seemed to stretch for miles. But Washington was not planning to wait for dawn. In his tent, surrounded by maps and the flickering light of candles, he was crafting another desperate gamble. The morning would indeed bring decision, but not in the way Lord Cornwallis expected. The old fox had one more trick to play, and it would transform the entire character of the war. Outside, the temperature began to drop, and the muddy roads that had plagued both armies started to freeze solid. A change in weather that would prove crucial to American independence. The frozen ground rang like iron beneath the wheels of Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery as Washington's army began its ghostly withdrawal from the Assunpink Creek line. It was 2 o'clock in the morning of January 3rd, 1777. At 5,000 American soldiers were attempting something that military historians would later call either brilliant or insane. A night march around the left flank of Cornwallis's army while leaving their campfires burning to maintain the illusion of occupation. Washington had gambled everything on a single tactical insight. Cornwallis expected him to either retreat across the Delaware or make a desperate stand at the creek. The British general had never considered that the Americans might abandon their defensive position and march deeper into enemy territory. It was a move so audacious that it bordered on military suicide. But Washington understood that conventional thinking would never defeat a conventional enemy. The march toward Princeton followed country roads that Washington knew from his surveying days, paths that wound through New Jersey's rolling farmland like serpents through a frozen garden. Every step took his army further from their Delaware River lifeline and deeper into British-controlled territory. Behind them, carefully maintained campfires continued to burn, tended by skeleton crews who would slip away just before dawn. The temperature had dropped to near zero, but the frozen roads that had been muddy traps the day before now provided solid footing for men and artillery. Nature, which had so often seemed to conspire against the Continental Army, was finally offering assistance. The wheels of Hamilton's cannons no longer sank into New Jersey mud, but rolled smoothly across ground as hard as Pennsylvania stone. Colonel John Cadwallader's Philadelphia militia, reinforced by New England veterans who had survived the retreat across New Jersey, formed the Army's advance guard. These men had learned hard lessons about British fighting ability, but they had also discovered something about themselves during the long retreat. They were tougher than they had imagined. The same soldiers who had fled in panic at Brandywine now marched through enemy territory with quiet confidence. As the column snaked through the darkness, Washington rode among his men, his presence a reassuring constant in the uncertainty of night movement. The general, who had been criticized for his defensive mentality, was now demonstrating tactical boldness that rivaled history's greatest commanders. Each mile covered brought his army closer to Princeton, where Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood commanded British forces. That included the 17th Foot. Veterans of campaigns from the Caribbean to Canada, the march was not without its dangers. British patrols roamed the countryside, and a single encounter could alert Cornwallis to Washington's movement. Scouts reported enemy cavalry moving along the main roads, forcing the American column to take longer routes through farmland, where every fence presented an obstacle, and every creek crossing threatened delay, according to military historian Thomas Fleming's detailed account in Washington's Secret War. This night march represented one of the most sophisticated tactical maneuvers attempted by American forces during the entire Revolutionary War. By dawn, Washington's gamble was approaching its crucial test. His army had successfully circled behind Cornwallis without detection, but they were now committed to battle with no possibility of retreat. Princeton lay ahead, defended by professional soldiers who would not be caught off guard as the Hessians had been at Trenton. Behind them, Cornwallis would soon discover the deception and begin pursuit with overwhelming force. The sun rose on January 3rd to reveal American forces in perhaps the most precarious position of the entire war. They were deep in enemy territory, outnumbered, and surrounded by hostile forces. Yet Washington's men advanced toward Princeton with something they had lacked for months: the confidence that comes from victory and the knowledge that their commander was capable of achieving the impossible. The sound of British drums echoing from Princeton indicated that Mawhood's garrison was beginning its morning routine. Unaware that 5,000 Continental soldiers were approaching through the winter mist, the stage was set for a collision that would determine whether Washington's brilliant maneuver would end in triumph or catastrophe die in the distance. Church bells in Princeton began to toll the hour, their bronze voices carrying across frozen fields. Where history was about to be written in smoke and blood, the morning mist clung to Princeton's frost-covered fields like the breath of sleeping giants. As Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood led his column of British regulars south toward Trenton, the 17-foot marched with mechanical precision, their scarlet uniforms bright against the winter landscape, muskets shouldered and bayonets gleaming. Mawhood had received orders to reinforce Cornwallis, and he was eager to participate in what promised to be the final crushing of Washington's rebellion. Neither commander initially realized they were marching toward collision. Washington's advance guard, led by General Hugh Mercer, moved northeast along the back roads toward Princeton, while Mawhood's column followed the main post road south. The two forces were converging like the arms of a closing trap, with neither aware of the other's proximity until the morning sun burned away the concealing mist. The first contact occurred near the William Clark farm, where Mercer's advance scouts spotted British uniforms through the trees. Captain John Fleming of the 1st Virginia Regiment raised his hand to halt the column, his weathered face grim as he counted enemy soldiers moving across a distant field. The moment of surprise that had served Washington so well at Trenton was about to be lost in the open ground around Princeton. Mercer, a Scottish physician turned soldier, who had served with Washington in the French and Indian War, immediately grasped the tactical situation. His force of approximately 350 men faced twice that number of British regulars, on ground that offered little natural advantage. The Americans held a slight elevation near the Quaker Meeting House, but Mawhood's troops were already deploying from column in the battle line. With professional efficiency, the British 17th Foot had earned their reputation in campaigns from the West Indies to the Canadian frontier. These were not garrison soldiers or green recruits, but veterans who had survived battles where lesser men had fallen. Their volleys, when they came, would be devastating and precisely timed. Mawhood himself was a competent officer who understood that rapid, aggressive action could crush American resistance before it had time to organize. The opening exchange of musketry shattered the morning quiet like thunder from a clear sky. British Brown Bess muskets roared in unison, their .75 caliber balls tearing through American ranks with deadly efficiency. Mercer's men, mostly Virginia militia with a sprinkling of Continental regulars, returned fire with whatever weapons they carried: hunting rifles, fowling pieces, and captured British muskets from Trenton. Military historian William Stryker, in his authoritative study of the Princeton campaign, noted that this engagement represented the first time American forces had met British regulars in open field combat since the disasters around New York City. The firefight quickly developed into a brutal close-quarters engagement that favored British training and discipline. Mawhood ordered a bayonet charge, and the 17th Foot advanced with a mechanical precision that had made British infantry feared across 3 continents. Their steel-tipped muskets caught the morning light as they swept forward, a scarlet tide that seemed unstoppable. Mercer's line began to waver under the assault. American militia, brave as individuals but lacking the drill of professional soldiers, found themselves facing the nightmare scenario that had haunted their training-disciplined troops advancing with fixed bayonets. Some men broke and ran, but others stood firm, loading and firing with desperate speed as the British line approached. General Mercer himself fell in the melee, struck down by British bayonets as he tried to rally his men. The loss of their commander sent shockwaves through the American line, and what had been an organized retreat threatened to become a full rout. British soldiers pressed their advantage, sensing that complete victory was within their grasp. But Washington had been riding toward the sound of battle, and his arrival transformed the entire character of the engagement. The general appeared on his white horse like a figure from classical mythology, his presence instantly recognizable to every American soldier on the field. Behind him rode Captain Hamilton with his artillery, the gun crews already unlimbering their pieces while still in motion. The sight of Washington seemed to electrify the retreating Americans. Men who had been running turned and began to form new defensive lines. The general himself rode directly into the firefight, positioning himself between the opposing forces, where British musket balls whistled past his head like angry insects. It was leadership of the most personal and dangerous kind, the sort that creates legends and changes the course of nations. As Hamilton's cannons roared to life, sending grape shot tearing through British ranks, the momentum of battle began to shift once again. The morning that had begun with such promise for British arms was about to take a dramatically different turn. The thunder of Hamilton's artillery transformed Princeton's peaceful fields into a hellscape of smoke and flying metal. The young captain, his face streaked with powder burns, directed his battery with the precision of a master craftsman. Each discharge of grape shot tore gaps in the British line that Mahud's sergeants frantically tried to fill. But the psychological impact was even greater than the physical damage the 17th Foot was. Discovering that American artillery could match British steel, Washington rode directly into the crossfire, his white horse dancing nervously as musket balls whined past rider and mount. The general's uniform coat bore fresh holes by the time he reached the wavering American line, but his presence alone seemed to transform frightened militia into determined soldiers. "Parade with us, my brave fellows," he shouted above the din. "There's but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." The psychology of battle turned on such moments. British soldiers, who minutes before had been advancing confidently behind their bayonets, now found themselves facing an enemy that refused to break. The American line, reinforced by Continental troops arriving from the main column, began to advance rather than retreat. For many British veterans, it was their first experience with American soldiers who fought with professional determination rather than militia enthusiasm. Lieutenant Colonel Mahud faced a commander's nightmarish carefully planned movement. To reinforce Cornwallis had devolved into a desperate battle against an enemy of unknown strength. His scouts reported additional American forces approaching from multiple directions, suggesting that Washington had brought his entire army to Princeton. The tactical situation that had favored British arms was rapidly becoming untenable. The 17th Foot, bloodied but still disciplined, began a fighting withdrawal toward Princeton itself. Their retreat was not the panicked flight that had characterized some earlier American victories, but the professional movement of soldiers who understood that discretion could preserve force for future battles. British officers maintained formation even as Hamilton's guns continued to exact their toll. As the main battle raged in the fields outside Princeton, a separate drama was unfolding within the town itself. The British 55th Foot, commanded by Captain William Scott, had barricaded themselves in Nassau Hall, the stone building that housed the College of New Jersey. From the windows of what would later become Princeton University, British soldiers poured musket fire into the streets, while American forces surrounded the building. Captain Hamilton, his artillery now positioned within range of Nassau Hall, prepared to demonstrate that even the most imposing architecture could not withstand American determination. The young officer personally sighted one of his 6-pound cannons at the building's main entrance, the iron barrel gleaming in the winter sunlight. The symbolism was not lost on either side. British forces cornered in an institution of learning, while American artillery prepared to blast them into submission. According to historian David Hackett Fisher's meticulous research, The fighting at Nassau Hall represented one of the first instances of urban combat during the Revolutionary War, prefiguring later struggles in cities from Charleston to Yorktown. The cannonball that crashed through Nassau Hall's main door seemed to carry with it the voice of American independence itself. Stone fragments scattered across the entrance hall, where colonial students had once debated philosophy and mathematics. The same building that had educated future American leaders was now witnessing the violent birth of the nation those leaders would govern. Captain Scott, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, emerged from Nassau Hall with a white flag. The 47 soldiers who surrendered represented the last organized British resistance in Princeton. Their capitulation marked not just the end of battle, but the completion of Washington's most audacious strategic gamble. As British prisoners were gathered in Princeton's Market Square, Washington received reports that made his victory complete. Cornwallis had discovered the deception at Assunpink Creek and was marching north with his entire army, but he was hours behind. The American army had sufficient time to gather prisoners, supplies, and wounded before continuing their withdrawal. The spoils of victory included not just military supplies, but something far more valuable proof that American forces could meet British regulars in open battle and emerge victorious. The psychological impact would resonate far beyond Princeton's borders, inspiring fence-sitters throughout the colonies to openly support the revolutionary cause. Yet Washington knew that one more battle, however brilliant, could not end the war. As his army prepared to withdraw to Ward winter quarters, British drums could be heard in the distance, announcing Cornwallis's approach with overwhelming force. The smoke of battle still hung over Princeton's blood-soaked fields as Washington made the most difficult decision of the campaign: withdrawal rather than pursuit. Every military instinct urged him to press his advantage, to continue the offensive that had transformed his army from desperate refugees into victorious soldiers. But the sound of approaching British drums reminded him that Cornwallis was marching north with 8,000 fresh troops, a force that could crush the Continental Army regardless of their recent successes. The withdrawal from Princeton tested American discipline as severely as the battle itself. Soldiers who had tasted victory wanted to continue fighting, to press their advantage against an enemy that had seemed invincible just days before. Washington's decision to retreat toward winter quarters in Morristown rather than pursue defeated British forces required explanation to officers who had begun to believe in the possibility of ending the war through military action. "Gentlemen," Washington addressed his senior commanders as they gathered in Princeton's bullet-scarred courthouse, "we have achieved more in 10 days than many thought possible in 10 years. But wars are not won by single battles, however brilliant. Our enemy has resources we cannot match, and our true victory lies not in destroying British armies, but in surviving the fight again." The march to Morristown became a race against time and weather. Cornwallis's pursuit was relentless, but hampered by the same icy roads that had aided American movement. During the night march to Princeton, British cavalry, exhausted from days of continuous campaigning, could not maintain contact with Washington's increasingly confident army. The psychological transformation was remarkable. The same soldiers who had fled across New Jersey in November now conducted a tactical withdrawal with professional competence. Captain Hamilton's artillery, which had played such a crucial role in both Trenton and Princeton, formed the Army's rear guard. The young officer had matured dramatically during the campaign, displaying not just technical competence, but the tactical insight that would later make him invaluable to Washington as an aide-de-camp. His guns covered each river crossing and road junction, buying precious time for the main army's withdrawal. The impact of Washington's victories extended far beyond the immediate military situation. News of Trenton and Princeton spread throughout the colonies like wildfire, transforming the political landscape overnight. Militia units that had disbanded after earlier defeats began to reform, and recruitment for the Continental Army increased dramatically. More importantly, foreign governments that had dismissed American independence as impossible began to reconsider their positions. Thomas Paine's contemporary account in The American Crisis captured the transformation in American morale. "These are the times that try men's souls, but the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. Yet we have seen that tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered." The British response to Princeton revealed the depth of their strategic confusion. Cornwallis, who had been confident of crushing the rebellion within days, now found himself commanding scattered garrisons Throughout New Jersey, while Washington's army remained intact and dangerous, British control of the colony, which had seemed absolute in December, was now limited to a few fortified positions connected by heavily guarded supply lines. King George III received news of the defeats with characteristic determination to continue the war, but Parliament began to voice doubts about the conflict's cost and duration. The victories had demonstrated that American forces could defeat professional European soldiers in conventional battle, a development that transformed international perceptions of the revolutionary cause. Washington established winter quarters in Morristown with an army that bore little resemblance to the force that had crossed the Delaware. Just weeks before, the men who constructed log huts in the New Jersey hills had been transformed by victory. From a collection of militia units into the beginning of a professional army, their confidence, earned through battle, would sustain them through the long war ahead. The Battle of Princeton had achieved something that no amount of political rhetoric could accomplish. It had proven that American independence was militarily viable. The psychological impact of Washington's tactical masterstroke resonated far beyond the frozen fields where British and American soldiers had shed their blood. It marked the moment when the American Revolution transformed from a desperate colonial rebellion into a war that would reshape the world. As Washington settled into his Morristown headquarters, he understood that Princeton had changed everything. The war would continue for years, with victories and defeats yet to come, but never again would anyone question whether Americans could stand against the world's greatest military power. The old fox had indeed escaped Cornwallis's trap, and in doing so, had secured something far more valuable than military victory. He had secured the birth of a nation. In the fading light of January 3rd, 1777, as the last American soldiers disappeared into the New Jersey hills, the echo of Hamilton's cannons still seemed to reverberate across the battlefield. It was the sound of a new world being born.